Hello students, I am appending a new intro to a video that I recorded for this content last year because we have two new visual communication in the news items. The first one was a front page story of the New York Times dealing with the fact that there are people who are suing Harvard University over the question of who owns their collection of photographs of enslaved Africans. And so it turns out that Harvard has been using these pictures that were created 170 years ago, possibly, in a sort of a racist study attempting to demonstrate that Africans were inferior to Caucasians. And so now the actual descendants of the enslaved people pictured are suing the university, saying you have no right to those photographs. Those are our ancestors. We own those photographs. The other item has to do with a similar issue in that the Museum of Natural History has for some time had dioramas which showed events in the past. So they had one in which the Dutch settlers in New York are sort of meeting with and negotiating with the natives who are Lenape Indians. But by today's standards, it is clearly sort of prejudicial against the Native Americans. So rather than, closing the diorama or just removing the content, what they did was they put labels on the glass through which visitors look into the diorama, pointing out the degree to which it misrepresented people. It misrepresented particularly the women in the diorama, how they would have dressed, and the fact that in actuality they would have held leadership positions. So those are both pretty interesting. And that leads us then into the content for this week, which basically has two heads. One is propaganda, and one is the notion of the public sphere. And they're both sort of quite related to each other. So I will now save this and append it to the video that introduces you to the content. A fair bit of it is sort of pages that I made attempting to make some complex and difficult material easier to understand. So I've given you sort of an easy intro into Jürgen Habermas and his notion of the public sphere. And then you've got readings. There will be a discussion board asking you to respond to one of the readings, and there will be a quiz on one of the readings. And then once I have received your visual analysis essays, what I will do is make a video that includes the images that you chose to analyze, because I think that's always pretty interesting, and maybe make some comments on some of the approaches that you took in your visual analysis essays. So this will now lead into the rest of the video relating to the content for you to view and read this week. And one of the topics that you'll be reading about for before next meeting is the public sphere. So the whole idea that as you're walking around or you're driving on the freeway and you see all these billboards, you are in a public space and you are subjected to untold number of images, usually advertising goods and services. And so just sort of who owns that public sphere is fairly interesting. If you looked at Naomi Klein's No Logo video, she talks about that and the idea that once upon a time there was a true public sphere, and now that a place like Starbucks has replaced the public sphere and is not really public. It's a private place because they can kick you out and then they can subject you to the ads that they want you to consume there, and prevent you from engaging in certain kinds of activity and speech within their private business. So the other one was a news article about Norman Rockwell's 4 freedoms, and I have a graphic of that I'll bring into this video once I've recorded it, and so it'll be there for you to look at as I'm talking about it. But FDR, before the U.S. got into World War II, before the bombing of Pearl Harbor, FDR gave a speech in which he articulated the 4 freedoms, and there was freedom from want, freedom of speech, freedom of want, freedom of religion, and freedom from fear. And so Norman Rockwell who was a very accomplished artist, and he was a commercial artist. A lot of what he did were things that ended up on the front page of Saturday Evening Post. And there are these nice American homey images of teachers and Boy Scouts and people fishing and you name it. Well, he became very much sort of involved in producing images and posters that ended up helping the war effort. So it turns out the posters of the four freedoms that Norman Rockwell produced once we entered the war in December. Those things ended up being sold as posters to raise money for war bonds, and those four images produced about $130 million worth of funds for the war effort. So it brings us to this notion of images for propaganda, and included in your viewing and consuming this week, you're going to look at some things which are American anti-fascist propaganda produced during World War II. Then you're also going to look at a fascist propaganda. There's a film by Leni Riefenstahl. And then you're going to look at some anti-communist propaganda from about 20 years ago when the Soviet Union was collapsing. So that's what you'll be looking at and reading this week. So the next topic on the agenda is mass media and the public sphere. So there is a philosopher by the name of Jürgen Habermas, and he would sort of fall into the same category as Roland Barthes, in that he's a sort of modern, maybe postmodern philosopher, and he's addressed pretty much everything under the sun, but the one thing that he is probably most relevant to us for has to do with mass media communications. And so there's a page in there that is sort of a brief synopsis of his thinking and talking about mass media, and I'll talk about that a bit more when I move on to it. And then there's a site, it's called The Powers of Persuasion, and basically it is a link to a Library of Congress source that has all of the American propaganda produced by the government during World War II to get people to sort of support the war effort and to not waste things, a variety of different approaches, some of it specifically aimed at women and how they could support the war effort, etc. So then we're going to look at Mind Over Media, Analyzing Propaganda. So that is a site that was created by the Media Literacy Foundation, which is at, I think it's at University of Rhode Island. And so that's a wonderful interactive site where you get to look at a particular message and then, evaluate it. Is it benevolent? Is it harmful? After you have made your decision, you click on it and you'll see how your judgment of it compares to somebody else. So that's a nice interactive site. And then we've got the reading assignments for next week. There will be two reading assignments. One is a collection of, it's an article, a peer-reviewed article about anti-communist propaganda from 20 years ago. And then there's another article which is about perception and memory. So if we think back to one of the first topics that we discussed was how it is that you perceive images and how that works in your brain. And there's some recent research that says, okay, if you think that what happens is first you perceive it and then you remember it or maybe misremember it, it turns out it's a little more complicated. And then the complications would relate quite a bit to Paul Martin Lester's 6 perspectives and to the Huxley notion about the more you know, the more you see. So it turns out that just taking in images visually and then responding to them is not exactly how it works. All right, so let me go through some of what we're going to do. So I mentioned the visual communication in the news, the 2 items. That the next page in the module, Mass Media and the Public Sphere, introduces you to Jürgen Habermas, and it's got a little quote from the Stanford Encyclopedia of philosophy. So if you're ever trying to understand something about a philosopher, you can always go to Wikipedia, but if you want sort of better quality information about a philosopher, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is similar to Wikipedia in that it is user-generated content, but it is sort of peer-reviewed, whereas Wikipedia, anybody can put anything up there. Some of it's high quality, some of it's not high quality, but the stuff in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is all high quality. So it tells you a little bit there about Jürgen Habermas, and basically it says, if one looks over his corpus of work, one can discern two broad lines of enduring interest, one having to do with the political domain and the other with issues of rationality, communication, and knowledge. So it's on the level of communication that Jürgen Habermas is influential to us. So he talks about the public sphere, and on that page there are pictures of Louis XIV's Palace of Versailles. And if you've ever been there, then you kind of know how outrageous and amazing it is. I had the good fortune to visit it a few years back, but there's some pictures in there. And the idea there is that during that period, the 18th century Europe, which he calls representational culture, what a king or a prince would do is create a palace that was so amazing that you would just be kind of stunned and in awe of the king and his powers just by witnessing the palace. And the couple images in there, the Palace of Versailles, will give you an idea of what that's about. Well, what Habermas says is that 18th century culture of representation gave way to something that he calls the public sphere. He's got a German word for it, Öffentlichkeit. And so this is more about things like the Masonic Lodge and the London Coffee House in Philadelphia. So now, instead of having this one fabulous space created by the king where everybody else gets just to look at it and be in awe of it, now you've got these kind of public places where people get together and banter ideas back and forth. And so one of the differences between the representational culture, where one was active and the other was passive, this public sphere basically is a dialogue between people. So if you think about the history, the founding fathers of the United States operating in their coffee houses in Boston and in Philadelphia, and what they're doing is they're thinking about, hey, we got this King George over in England and he's giving us kind of a raw deal here. What are we going to do about this? So one of the things that Habermas claims is that the eventual decline of the King of France had to do with moving from representational culture to a public sphere, and that's what allowed for the French Revolution. And so then in that article it goes on, and there's a still image from Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will. So that was sort of an amazing moment in history when the Third Reich came to power and took over sort of the will of a large mass of people and was able to direct it in one effort with catastrophic results and sort of leading to World War II. And so we'll talk about that when I get to the particular page about Leni Riefenstahl's movie. You'll have some particular spots where I'm suggesting you take a look at those images there. But it's an example of how images can be used for propaganda in a way that can be very powerful upon people because they're operating sort of on an unconscious level. And so then a little further down, you've got this box, and it's explaining how Habermas, his theory of communicative action, is based upon Talcott Parsons, who is sort of one of the fathers of sociology, and he's got this agile paradigm, AGIL, and those things stand for adaptation, goal attainment, integration, and latency. And so there's a little box that explains it, and in a sort of one of the simplest possible cultures in which this could be explained, he uses the hunter-gatherer community. And so I'll just read that here. It says, the four parts of the agile paradigm four functions aim to be intuitive. For example, a tribal system of hunter-gatherers needs to gather food from the external world by hunting animals and gathering other goods. So that's the adaptation motion, where they're basically harvesting natural resources, or they're producing commodities. they need to have set a set of goals and a system to make decisions about such things as when to migrate to better hunting grounds. So that's the goal attainment level. And so in a more advanced culture, you get political offices, but the idea is that a community will have common goals. And then the tribe also needs to have a common belief system that enforces actions and decisions as the community sees fit. So that's where we get religious systems, and Habermas would say, and that's where mass media enters. So just like, in a simpler society, the religion of a given community or culture would give people a set of rules to live by. It's quite possible that much of that now has been replaced by mass media, has replaced much of that function about how we should be, right? The tribe also needs to have common beliefs that enforces actions and decisions as the community sees fit. Finally, there needs to be some kind of educational system to pass on hunting and gathering skills and common belief systems. And that in that category, we have family schools. If these prerequisites are met, the tribe can sustain its existence. So that's where Habermas took an idea from a previous sociologist and said, this is how a community can stay alive. And the whole thing, all four parts of it, is considered to be his theory of communicative action, right? So then there are people who are critical of Habermas. There's a couple of them mentioned at the end of that page. Several noted academics have provided various criticisms of Habermas's notion regarding the public sphere. John B. Thompson, a professor of sociology at the University of Cambridge and a fellow of Jesus College, has pointed out that Habermas's notion of the public sphere is antiquated due to the proliferation of mass media communications. So it's quite possible that Habermas's public sphere made good sense maybe early to mid 20th century, but now because of the evolution of mass media communications, some of his ideas might not hold true anymore. And another critic, Michael Schudson from the University of California, San Diego, argues more generally that a public sphere as a place of purely rational, independent debate never existed. So this is something that often happens when somebody comes up with a theory and they say, okay, this is how it was when Ben Franklin and some other people are sitting around in a coffee house in Philadelphia making plans for the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence, and it's purely rational. And somebody comes back and says, wait, it was never purely rational. So your model of the change from this one public sphere to a different kind of public sphere is based upon a romantic fiction about how it was before it turned into what it turned into. Okay, so the purpose of all that public sphere stuff is to give you sort of a theoretical background within which to think about the powers of persuasion. So the next page talks about the National Archives' power of persuasions. There's a link there, and it will take you to this two-part thing, which is basically the propaganda, the American-produced pro-Allied forces propaganda during World War II. And so in there, we've got part one, which has Man the Guns, It's a Woman's War too, United We Win, Use It Up, Wear It Out, and the Four Freedoms. So back to that notion of the four freedoms are in there. And then part two is Warning, Our Homes Are in Danger Now. This is Nazi brutality. He's watching you. He knew the meaning of sacrifice, and stamp them out. And so what these are, they're remarkable posters. These are posters made by sort of the most talented and sort of brilliant graphical artists of the day who have been engaged by the government to produce posters that have images and text generally. I doubt any of them are just a picture. They're all going to have words. And so I want you to take a look through them and get a sense of how powerful these things must have been in their day. Some of them are still powerful now, and some of them are, a little problematic in terms of the way they are attempting to get people to support the war effort by demonizing or dehumanizing the enemy combatants. Okay, so should look at that. And then the next page in the site is Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will. So there's a link there to a YouTube movie. It's an hour and 44 minutes long. I don't expect anybody to watch the whole thing. One of the features of movies made not recently is the pacing is just very slow compared to what we're used to. But you think this was made at a time when movies were brand new. It's mostly a silent film. There is a musical track attached to it, which is sort of German classical music. There are a couple places where you get to hear Hitler speak. But one of the things you can do with a YouTube movie is you go to the speed, and when it says normal, you can play it at 1.5, 1.5, or 2 times the regular speed. So that allows you to get through things at a much more reasonable pace. I highly recommend that you watch, I'd say watch it at 1.25 or 1.5 and watch a good few minutes at the intro, okay? There's a title sequence you can skip. It goes up to 240. But basically, one of the interesting things about the title sequence is here's a time when movies are brand new and hardly anybody has been in an airplane. And the beginning of the movie starts shot from an airplane as Hitler is coming into Nuremberg. And so then below the YouTube video link, there are timestamps where I'll tell you what's in the movie. And so I'd say take a look at several of those moments. Say like when you go to 8 minutes is when Hitler arrives at his destination. At 12:30 is flags and architecture. 13:40 is church. Then we get drums and bugles, horseplay, accordion, etc. And so each one of these moments is some image that was chosen by this woman filmmaker, Leni Riefenstahl, to evoke in the audience these Germans, particularly Germans who weren't Jewish or any of the sort of ethnic groups who weren't sort of like purely Teutonic German. And these images are chosen to get those people united in the cause of saying the Third Reich is going to be the greatest thing ever and we're going to take over the world. So watch as much of that film as you can handle to get a sense of it, okay? Then we've got the Mind Over Media Analyzing Propaganda. So there's a link to the Media Education Lab at the University of Rhode Island. And so that is something that has sort of been developed much through the efforts of Renee Hobbs. Renee Hobbs was a communications faculty at Temple, and then she went on to become the first dean of the School of, Communication at University of Rhode Island, and she now runs the university, the Media Education Lab. But the link called propagandamediaeducationlab.com, that's where you get Mind Over Media. And what you have are examples of some of which is clearly propaganda. Others you can say, oh no, that's just an ad for something. But it's interactive. And so what you can do is you can pick one of 4 different propaganda techniques. So you can choose activate strong emotions, or respond to audience needs, or simplify information ideas, or attack the opponents. And then once you've picked a category, then what happens is you've got samples that you can view, okay? And then what you get to do is you get to watch a sample. So I've got one here. And sometimes it's a still picture, sometimes it's a video. And you watch the video, some of them are quite short, and then you get to rate it from beneficial to harmful. And then once you've rated it, you get to see how you're rating compared to other people who had rated it. And then if you want to, you can put a comment on it. So this is it's a wonderful interactive tool where you get to look at a variety of kinds of propaganda. And some you might look and say, well, that's not propaganda. That's just, that's information. That's clear and accurate information on some topic, okay? So I'd like you to interact with the Mind Over Media interactions a bit. Then, visual manipulations in mass media. So this is one of your 2 readings, and it's from a 1998 issue of the Journal of Visual Literacy. And I realize it's 20 years old. I looked to find something more recent, but I did not find anything that was quite as good in terms of visual content. Because a lot of these peer-reviewed articles in journals of education or about communication, it's all words and no pictures. And one of the great ones about this is that it has a lot of pictures. So what you have are lots of examples of political cartoons that were produced in Russia and some of the former Soviet satellite countries. And generally, these are sort of all anti-communist cartoons satirizing certain aspects of communism. So I want you to look at that, and then I'm probably going to create a discussion board asking a few questions, pointed questions about it, and what you found, effective or not effective. Then there is one more reading, and it's perception and memory. And so that link there links to two different things. There's a short article from Scientific American that tells you about the article, okay? Tells you what the article finds. And then the other link is the actual article itself. And this is from, what is the journal that it's from? Psychological Science, I believe. And so it's talking about the fact that you perceive something and then you remember it. And the length of time between when you perceived it and when you misremember it is about a 20th of a second. So the notion that you looked at a TV ad and then you got it in your head and then you remember it, and maybe a week later somebody says what was in the ad and says, okay, and that maybe your memory would get foggy after a week. No, after 1/20th of a second, your memory is no longer accurate. And so one of the things that opens up the whole question of this notion of sequence of perception first, memory second, might even be open to question. And that then returns us to Paul Martin Lester and Huxley. The more you know, the more you see. It's quite possible that what you know impacts your perception in a way that you can only perceive things that match what you already know. And that becomes a very interesting and sticky philosophical question, okay? So I think that's the introduction that we have so far. So you can expect two things in the coming days, three things. One, as I read your analysis of the images, I'll then be creating a video which, because you haven't shared them with each other. So what I'll be doing is creating a video that has the images that you chose, and what I'll do is share with everybody else in the class some of the things that you said about it. That's one thing you'll be getting. The next thing you'll be getting is a quiz on the chapter about perception and memory, and that'll be in Canvas by Wednesday. And then a little discussion board assignment, short discussion board, getting a response from you about the political cartoons. So we've got three different kinds of propaganda. We've got American pro-Allies propaganda as we go into World War II. We've got Nazi propaganda before World War II. And then we've got Russian and satellite country anti-communist propaganda. So that's plenty of propaganda for 1 week. I will be back in touch with you as soon as I am. So I'm going to save this, put in those images of the four freedoms for that portion where I'm talking about that, and then post it to YouTube. Talk to you later.